Hi everyone, my name is Ashley June and I am a rising sophomore at the Loomis Shafee School located in Windsor, Connecticut, and I'm from Old Tappan, New Jersey. And today I am going to be sharing my summary of Dr. Sacks's book, The Age of Sustainable Development, specifically Chapter 10. And Chapter 10 mainly focuses on food security. And I personally found this chapter to be really intriguing and I really enjoyed learning about all this. So I hope you also enjoyed this video. So before we get into the different sections of this chapter, I would like to first provide with some guiding questions that you can use as you listen to this video and as you read this chapter if you are planning on doing that. So first is, what are the different types of malnutrition? What are the trends in global food prices and what are the consequences? 3, what are the environmental threats to food production? 4, what are the problems with the current agricultural practices around the world? 5, what can be done to move towards a sustainable development path in agriculture? And 6, how and why we need to take responsibility for our personal health and the way we approach food as individuals. And next, I kind of went through and figured that some key terms and concepts might need a little bit more of explanation. So I kind of listed some of that here. I'm not going to go through everything, but you can always stop this video and look through the definitions and these key concepts. Sorry. Yeah. So this chapter is divided into a few different sections. And the first section kind of just establishes the kind of problems that Dr. Sachs is going to explore further in the other sections. So mostly talks about the sustainable food supply and the end of hunger. So he lists 4 different problems regarding food security. And the first was that a significant share of the world population today is malnourished. And he talks about 3 different types of malnourishment, which is 1, chronic hunger or undernourishment, which is when someone has an insufficient intake of energy or calories and proteins in their body. Second is hidden hunger or micronutrient insufficiency, which is when vitamins or particular fatty acids are not adequately presented in our diet or present in our diet. And 3 is obesity, which I'm guessing is the most common one that a lot of people know. And this is just describing the excessive intake of calorie of an individual. And apparently obesity is kind of often seen in richer country, which kind of makes sense because richer countries have more access to better and more foods, both quality and quantity wise. And according to statistics, out of the 7.2 billion people in the world, 3 billion of them kind of suffer from malnourishment, which is roughly 40%. So it kind of establishes how serious of an issue this malnourishment and this problem is. And this is really important to kind of for us to kind of take a sustainable step towards too, because someone who is malnourished can go through such adverse health issues, and their physical development might be also irreparably damaged. And the idea that Dr. Sachs kind of mentions throughout this entire chapter, the underlying idea was that he encourages more physical activity in all of our daily lives. And the second problem that he talks about is that the global population continues to rise as day goes on, and how because the population is rising, there is definitely a rise in food demand. And as food demand increases, but there aren't enough food to supply that to our world population, it obviously increases the global food prices as well. And the third problem that he talks about is how the climate change and other environmental changes are threatening the future food production. And they talk about how the global food supply is currently becoming destabilized, and our food production has been very unstable due to these environmental issues. And the specific environmental issues I will definitely touch upon later on in this summary. And the last problem that he identifies is that the food system itself is a major contributor to climate change and other environmental harms, which I will also talk about later in this video. So moving on to the next section, which Dr. Sachs talks about farm systems, ecology, and food security. He first kind of lays out this section by talking about how there are variations in farm systems. And because there's variations, obviously that's the reason why there isn't a single definite answer to how farmers can become more productive and resilient to environmental risks when farming and doing agriculture, because farming is just so different for like it differs. The form of farming and like agriculture differs around the world, which means that it's the way that like there's no one solution to how we can like solve all of these issues regarding food security and food security and more. And he also talks about how the locations of cropland and forest shapes these systems. And I'm hoping that that kind of makes sense as I talk about like temperate zones. So temperate mid latitude zones are currently being deforested for reasons like croplands and pasture lands so that they can get fuel wood and other goods and services, but also because they're being cut down. These zones are being cut down and replaced by massive tree plantations so that people can grow high demand products like palm oil. And this is like the perfect location to do this because temperate mid-latitude zones are like the perfect place for agriculture. It has the perfect temperature, precipitation, and etc. So which is like perfect. So people are kind of like deforesting these areas so that they can grow like more like high demanding products like palm oil, as I said. But then on the other hand, seasonal tropical environments, these areas aren't the best for farming and for agriculture because it has low average rainfall and it has a very high vulnerability to drought. So when people and ethnic groups who live in these areas, when they encounter these issues, obviously they encounter food insecurity at the same time and they become malnourished. So then they decide to move out. But as they move out, they obviously encounter other ethnic groups that are also competing for scarce land and water, for more land and water, because they're also struggling with the same kind of issue. So then as they encounter other ethnic groups, instead of kind of collaborating with them or like talking with them, they actually kind of create some kind of a violence. So there's like an explosion in violence. So then they start to fight and more on. And this kind of like issue actually occurred in Darfur, Ethiopia, and northern Mali before. So it is like in real life, it actually does happen. And Dr. Sachs said something like he wrote something really interesting here that I wanted to share was how he talks about how these kind of violence, when it's like, it's like reported or it's like found out by like really big countries like the United States, we respond to this, we kind of assist them with military approaches only. They always send military troops, military equipment, etc., so that they can win this war or like civil work, basically. But Dr. Sachs talks about how this is not what should be happening. Rather, what should happen is that these like United States, big countries like United States, like military strategists and like the NATO and Washington, D.C., they should try to like see like and address and underlying problems that are creating violence in the first place, which is like poverty, climate change, unsustainable population increase, and stuff like that. So Dr. Sachs is talking about how like they need to focus on these like human ecological dimensions of the crisis instead of just always providing with more military like equipment and just like finding military approaches. And the next section is about how environmental change threatens the food system. And basically Dr. Sachs kind of like lists different kind of environmental like issues here. One being population growth, how the current food supply again cannot feed every one of us. And second, more meat consumption is another problem because in order to raise these like meat animals like pig and cows, they're kind of being fed. In order to do that, they need to be fed grains. But if we want to feed grains, obviously the demand for grains also increase at the same time. And he also talks about climate change, but climate change is a very, very big umbrella. I understand that. And so to break kind of things apart and like separate it a little bit so it kind of makes more sense. Dr. Sachs talks about the human emissions of greenhouse gases, which we also say GHGs, or higher temperatures, which will lead to seeds becoming infertile. And 3, becoming global warming, which means that the world will become drier. And in a dry environment, it is basically impossible to grow crops because precipitation is necessary in order for crop growth. He also talks about rising sea levels and carbon dioxide emissions, which acidify oceans. And Dr. Sachs goes into this a little bit more deeper. And he talks about how like acidifying oceans can lead to smaller and damaged shellfishes, which impedes the formation of calcium carbonate shells, which is a threat to biodiversity and human nutrition, which is obviously a threat. And he also talks about the use of pesticide and herbicides to grow crops, because pesticide basically poison the soils, which is not good for agriculture and crop development. And he also talks about invasive species, which are basically animal or plant species that are deliberately or accidentally relocated from one environment to another environment that like deranges the entire ecology. And then he talks about how these species, invasive species, can run wild or overtake the native species. And lastly, he talks about water availability and especially fresh water that are being overused for crop irrigation. And it seemed like water availability and the idea of water was like a big issue, like is a currently really big issue, because he talks about how there are some major rivers that are being overused right now for agriculture and crop development, to the point that they're not even flowing to the sea. These rivers cannot meet the seawater because the river water is basically almost gone because of human use. And this decline of river flow that are being noticed due to climate change is also seen in Yellow River in northern China. And next section, Dr. Sachs talks about how the food system threatens the environment. So mainly he talks about how, so to begin with, he kind of establishes how food production is one of the most important single driver of environmental harms, which is quite surprising, honestly. But then he establishes and discusses the pressures that are being generated by agriculture that threatens and harms our environment. And he kind of talks about three different things, which is one is GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions. And apparently, according to him, the farm sector is the major emitter of the major three greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, which is obviously harmful for our environment. And then next, he talks about the nitrogen cycle and the use of nitrogen fertilizer and the creation of ammonia, and how the nitrogen is being put inside the soil as a way of a chemical based fertilizer, which basically changes the intensity of nitrogen fluxes in the environment when it is used so heavily. So it basically threatens our environment. But then Dr. Sachs talks about and brings up the question but how can we develop this, because nitrogen is essential, but it's also so harmful at the same time. And lastly, he talks about the habitat destruction for other species by human hands. And lastly, he talks about the ways we can move forward and towards a sustainable global food supply. So first, he points out how continuing the BAU, which is business as usual, and what we're doing right now in a current status quo, he talks about how this will only increase food insecurity and further damage our environment. And what we're doing, our approach is, it's wrong and it's not going to work. But instead, he brings up a new idea called sustainable development trajectory, basically ASD trajectory, as he calls it. And before he even gives us the specific, he talks about how, again, there's going to be varied responses about this trajectory, and it's going to be carefully tailored to local context. So it's not going to be same for the same region, and each region will have to identify its own pathway, because different environments work differently and they have different farm systems. So the first thing that he talks about is how we can improve the ability to grow food through natural plant breeding or genetic modifications. So genetic modification creates GMOs, which are acronym for genetically modified organisms. And even he talks about how even though GMOs have such ethical concerns that are rising right now, he talks about how it's still, in his opinion, it's how important he thinks that it's still important to give it a try. And second, he talks about how we can make crop varieties more nutritious, which is when the idea of golden rice kind of came up, and I kind of talked about that you can kind of see what that means in the key terms and concept slide. And next, he talks about precision farming, or as we call it, information-rich farming. And with this kind of farming, more food can be produced with basically less environmental impact. And precision farming allows for us to be more precise, to have more precise application for fertilizing. And it allows for better nutrient management, better soil testing, soil mapping, and having a more detailed nutrition of the soil needs, so we can take care of this soil in the right way, or in the best way, basically. Or it can also improve the water management system, which are a big problem, as I mentioned before. And lastly, we can also better harvest and storage and transport crops. And lastly, and most importantly, he talks about how in order for us to move towards a sustainable global food supply, it's important for all of us to take personal responsibility, like eating healthier with a balanced diet and making better and conscious choices when we're farming and doing agriculture. So that's it for the presentation and the summary of Chapter 10, Food Security. And I hope you enjoyed and learned a little bit more about food security. And I thought a good way to end off this video would be kind of sharing with you all about a quote that I found in this chapter that I found inspiring, which Dr. Sachs states, not only are we coming to realize that a large portion of humanity is poorly fed, but we are also realizing the seriousness of the threats to global food security that lie ahead. And that's it. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you in a different video.